Hello there, guys. Wikipedia is kind of a guilty pleasure of mine. I know they tell you not to use it in school, but I can't help myself. It's just too much fun to use. And one of my favorite features on the website is the signature section that appears whenever you click on the page of a significant or important person. Depending on how famous the person is, mixed in with their biographical information and factoids, is an example of their signature, digitized into a PNG or SVG file. You get to see an example of what this person's handwriting looks like, how they would sign their name, even if you will never get the chance to meet this person in the flesh. We as a culture have an odd fascination with signatures and autographs of notable people. Whenever we get the rare opportunity to meet someone famous, it is almost second nature for us to immediately ask them to write something, if it be on a poster, a t-shirt, or even just a napkin. Believe it or not, I've been on both sides of the coin. I'm really not that famous, but I have been recognized by a fan or two from time to time and asked for an autograph. Over the years, I myself have amassed a humble collection of signatures from a handful of pseudo-celebrities, from the guy that played Jet Jagger, to Sebulba, to former President Jimmy Carter. I've been to countless restaurants that proudly hang signed photographs of famous patrons on their walls. I've even been to a museum exhibit where the only things on display were the signatures of every US president. By the way, in my opinion, the president with the best handwriting by a wide margin was John Quincy Adams, and the worst was Dwight D. Eisenhower. A quick look online reveals that some people will charge and others will pay millions of dollars just for the right to own a bit of a famous person's handwriting, typically a musician, actor, or athlete. And there is a whole industry centered around collecting, selling, and authenticating these autographs with its own lingo and classification system. At a certain point, you must admit it is kind of strange that we assign so much value and importance to literal scribbles on a page. The signature or mark of a person we, or at least some people, regard as important, is apparently worth far more than the paper and ink that were used to create it, sometimes outrageously so. And it doesn't really matter what they wrote. It can be their name, it can be a compliment or advice, it can be a doodle. All that seems to matter is that it was written by that person and no one else. The average American typically signs their names on receipts and forms more times in just 1 year than they can even remember. We leave a trail of our own autographs behind us wherever we go, by basically just existing in society. And they all bear our own personal script entirely unique to us. But these marks are worthless, at least worthless to anyone other than ourselves and the people that know us. They don't really have monetary value. However, when a famous person does the same thing, their handwriting takes on an almost religious quality, cherished and treasured by total strangers. Perhaps it has something to do with our own abstract sense of value and worth. Maybe by possessing a famous person's signature, we ourselves are in some way getting a little piece of that fame, a piece of that noteworthy person that we can bring home with us and show off to others who don't. Or maybe it is just a reminder of that special memory, of the time our ordinary, boring lives were interrupted and we met someone important, somebody who changes the world. Like I said, the handwriting of a person feels oddly personal. When you look at it, you are, in a way, getting inside a person's head and seeing a bit of their personality. You get to see if it is neat or messy, if they write big or small, things you would never see on TV or even learn by talking to them. One of the main indicators of an autograph's value, in addition to the fame of the writer, is its rarity. The rarest signatures are almost always the most valuable ones. Autographs, like almost anything, function by the economic law of supply and demand. Typically when someone dies, the value of their pre-existing handwriting skyrockets, sometimes doubling or tripling. The reason for this is obvious. When someone dies, their handwriting dies with them. Whatever they managed to sign while they were still alive is all there is and all there will ever be. No additional autographs will ever be produced. Anything made after their death will just be an imitation or a forgery created by someone else, someone who is not them, and thus defeat the purpose. Today, I wanted to ask, what is the rarest autograph in existence, the hardest to find and most valuable signature belonging to a famous, historically important person? Well, to start out, as much as people today will pay for the signatures of recent figures and celebrities like Albert Einstein, Marilyn Monroe, Kurt Cobain, or John Lennon, in the grand scheme of things, these autographs are far from rare. Even celebrities that have tried to limit the amount of their autographs in circulation must eventually sign legal or tax documents with the government or the bank. So for anyone born within the last 100 years, there are literally thousands, if not tens of thousands of documents containing samples of their handwriting. Even if these are not open to the public or available for sale, they still exist and could be at a later date. All these documents could eventually turn into autographs, even if they were never intended to be. This means that for pretty much every famous person within the last few hundred years, from Vanilla Ice to Mahatma Gandhi, we actually have a huge collection of their signatures, sometimes scattered across the world. Even for somebody seemingly as distant as George Washington, a man who lived over 200 years ago, we have countless letters, receipts, contracts, deeds, titles, and treaties, all containing his handwriting. This amounts to thousands, maybe even tens of thousands of surviving examples. Nonetheless, George Washington's autographs still managed to sell for fortunes. To this date, the most expensive autograph ever sold was George Washington's own personal copy of the US Constitution, signed by himself and sold at auction for a whopping $9.8 million. But as valuable as these autographs are, they're definitely not as rare as you would think. The truth is, we have a relatively large supply of them. And believe it or not, this is the case for most historical figures up until maybe the 1400s. People in Renaissance Europe were not too different from us, and needed to routinely sign letters as well as bills. So there are surviving manuscripts bearing the signatures of Christopher Columbus, Machiavelli, Richard III, and Michelangelo. It is important to point out, however, that as we travel back further in time, and the historical figures or celebrities grow more distant to us, we begin to see a problem. The supply of these remaining autographs for each person gets progressively smaller and smaller. It might shock people to learn that William Shakespeare, a man that lived a little over 100 years before George Washington, has remarkably few samples of his handwriting that survive today. There are only 6 signatures in existence, generally agreed upon by historians to have been made by the famous British bard. All of them are legal documents, wills, mortgages, and courtroom depositions. Scholars have also argued that 3 surviving pages of the play Sir Thomas More may have been written by the same hand as well, but with such a small sample size to choose from, it's hard for modern experts to verify this claim. Besides those 3 pages, however, there are no original copies of Shakespeare's play actually penned by Shakespeare. That's right, all we have now are copies written or typed by someone else. So at best, the number of William Shakespeare autographs in existence is well below 10. One historian once estimated that the value of any one of these 6 authenticated signatures, if they were ever sold, would fetch somewhere between $4.5 to $5 million. Joan of Arc, the teenage French woman of Clone High fame, existed around 150 years before Shakespeare's time, and she has even fewer surviving examples of her handwriting. Although she herself could not read or write, she could sign her name on letters written for her by someone else. 3 examples of which remain to this day. These signatures indicate that she signed her name as Jeanne, the medieval spelling of Jean. As a general rule, this gradually shrinking pool of signatures dwindles smaller and smaller as we go back further in time, to the point that once we reach the European Middle Ages, about 1,000 years ago, we tend to only have a single surviving example of anyone's handwriting. Probably the oldest document that would meet our typical definition of an autograph from a major historical figure is the signature of the legendary Spanish knight Rodrigo Diaz de Vivar, more commonly known as El Cid. On a manuscript dated to the year 1098, recording the knight's donation to cathedral, we can see that at the very end of the text, a man with a somewhat heavy hand signed his name in bold Latin letters as Ego Rodrigo, or I Rodrigo, together with my wife affirm what is written above. A contender for this title of oldest autograph is dated to about 300 years before El Cid's. On August 31st, 790 AD, one of the most powerful men in the world at that time signed a decree in Kufstein, Austria. His signature was more of a doodle than a word. This odd cross-like symbol is called a monogram and was a popular substitution for spelling out someone's full name. It can be read like a wheel, with the center diamond serving the triple purpose of being an A, O, and V or U. This particular example spells out Carolus, the medieval Latin rendering of Carlos or Charles. The text written in a different hand on either side of this monogram explains that this is the signum or mark of Charles the Most Glorious King. This symbol in the middle was drawn by none other than the Holy Roman Emperor, Charlemagne the Great. Direct ancestor of Count Dooku and Saruman, by the way. Charlemagne, much like Joan of Arc, was illiterate, unable to read or write, so to make up for the shortcoming, he simply drew his personal monogram, basically a glorified doodle, on royal documents to certify his approval. So this is as close as you're going to get to seeing what his handwriting would have looked like. In all likelihood, it was all Charlemagne could do. However, for anyone existing beyond the state, older than Charlemagne, we simply have nothing. Autograph hunters consider the 1000s AD, or the start of the High Middle Ages, to be the point where we start to hit historical bedrock as far as famous autographs go. For centuries, historians have sought in vain for the signatures of Julius Caesar, Plato, Alexander the Great, and Jesus Christ, and have always come back entirely empty-handed. Strangely, it seems like any handwriting belonging to notable people living in ancient times, 2,000 years ago or more, simply does not exist. There are multiple reasons for this, but probably the biggest one is lack of preservation. As I talked about in my Books You Can Never Read video, paper, the material that people write on the most, tends to rot. Exposed to the elements, most documents can scarcely last a few months. Even in the best conditions, paper can usually only survive a few decades before becoming vulnerable to mold, not to mention the hungry mouths of bookworms, mice, and other pests. 1,000 years is a long time, not to mention 2,000 or 3,000. Empires rise and fall. There are wars, famine, and natural disasters. Buildings burn down or collapse into ruin. Rivers and seas rise, flooding entire regions. And whatever didn't deteriorate naturally must have been a tempting target for recycling in the ensuing centuries. Old, useless papers lying around can burn well and warm a house on a cold winter's night. Paper, and by proxy the handwriting made on it, is in a constant battle against the elements, one that it always loses eventually, some sooner than others. This never-ending process explains why so few autographs from the ancient world survive to us. In general, any document surviving over 1,000 years is rare. Only a small percentage of all the papers written have managed to survive the ravages of time, and this typically occurs only in specific locations and under rare specific conditions. Most of the surviving papers we have from the ancient world tend to come from arid and dry regions like Egypt. This small percentage still amounts to a lot though, and within these survivors we do find plenty of signatures belonging to ancient people, stretching back to when civilization began, from the doodles of school children to passive-aggressive Babylonian bureaucrats. But these can hardly be considered autographs, as the writers are almost always obscure and otherwise historically unknown people. Average Joes like you and me. The signatures never seem to contain the names of famous people who changed the course of history. And there's an explanation for this as well, and it has to do with the culture around writing itself before the modern era. The truth is that for most of history, people didn't write that much, at least not with their own hands. The idea that you yourself would lift a pen and write a whole essay, or even just a letter, is a remarkably recent concept, starting around the late Middle Ages. Before that, especially in ancient times, writing was largely left to a class of specialists, whose sole purpose in life it was to write. These were priests, monks, bureaucrats, and scribes, not the average person, and typically not important people. Now, this didn't necessarily mean that most people in the ancient world were illiterate, though that was sometimes the case. In many instances, we know that certain people could in fact read and write, but in practice they just didn't seem to do it that much. Writing is tedious and time-consuming, and this was far more so in ancient times, when writing materials were expensive, paper was in limited supply, and people were taught that they needed to say the words aloud as they wrote and read them. Yes, silent reading appears to have been a rare superpower back then. Consequently, in antiquity, writing developed a somewhat bad reputation, associated with the lower class, and believe it or not, slaves. Even though people from wealthy and aristocratic families were taught to read and write, they seem to have thought the task itself was beneath them. It appears to have been far more common, especially if you could afford it, to delegate the task of writing to someone else, namely a scribe or secretary, whose entire job it was to take dictation for their master. This is why the majority of ancient texts were disproportionately authored by scribes and government officials. They seem to have been the only ones writing things, because they often wrote on behalf of pretty much everyone else. On some surviving ancient documents, you can see clear signs of this class divide just by looking at the handwriting. This is a certificate of pagan sacrifice, discovered at the ancient Egyptian site of Theodosia. According to itself, the document was created on the 26th day of the Egyptian month of Paoni, during the first year of Imperator Caesar Gaius Messius Quintus Trajanus Decius Pius Felix Augustus, or to us, June 26th, around the year 250 AD, during the reign of Roman Emperor Decius. During the reign of this Decius, a government inspector was required to go around every province of the Roman Empire and determine if the inhabitants of an area were making their proper religious sacrifices and rituals. Ostensibly, it was intended to root out those meddling Christians, whose stubborn refusal made them traitors and enemies of the state. The holder of this particular document, however, seems to have passed the inspection. A Roman official wrote it out to certify that this person and her household were in fact sacrificing. The certificate, however, needed witnesses to sign their name and confirm this information was correct. There are 2 signatories. Let me know if you can spot one of them. Yes, as we can see, one of the signatures comes from a man named Ermias, and his handwriting is not as practiced as the scribe who wrote out the certificate or even his fellow signatory. The letters of Ermias' name are scribbled out in a huge and almost childish hand, taking up a very large portion of the document. In the amount of space he needed to write his short name, the government official could write out a whole paragraph of information. We actually have 2 other papyrus documents where this same Ermias was asked to certify the sacrifices of other people in his town. We can see that Ermias pretty consistently struggled to spell out his own name. All this suggests he did not have much practice writing and did it relatively rarely, probably only when he had to sign a document for his direct approval. And the strange thing is that Ermias seems to have been a pretty popular and respectable figure in his community. Ermias is probably a good example of how bad the handwriting of some people in antiquity could get. The reality is that we seldom get to see the handwriting of non-scribes in ancient texts, and the few times we do, it is typically sloppy and unpracticed. Again, suggesting that the average person's writing hands saw little use throughout their lives. Scholars call this phenomenon signature literacy, and it appears to have been the norm within many ancient societies, and maybe for much of human history. People who are signature literate can basically scratch out a word or two, typically their own name or a common phrase, and could probably read it, but they didn't and probably couldn't write long passages of text themselves. The prime movers and celebrities of ancient times were kings, queens, generals, and aristocrats, all people who could afford a scribe and sometimes even whole teams of scribes to write stuff for them. So realistically, why would they trouble themselves? Why lift a finger when you can get somebody to do it for you? The consequence of all this is that the chances of finding handwriting belonging to someone famous over 1,000 years ago are incredibly slim. The odds just become stacked against us. In the unlikely chance a text survived the ancient world, a tall order in itself, there was an even more unlikely chance it was directly written by someone with historical significance. Many researchers have accepted that it is just practically impossible. You'd legitimately have a better chance of winning the lottery multiple times in a row. The few famous ancient signatures that would have even existed in the first place by now have probably turned to dust and cannot be recovered. There are no ancient autographs. Well, that's what I would say, if not for 3 notable exceptions. Some meticulous, creative, and above all else, lucky scholars think they have found autographs that have managed to defy the odds. Autographs that have survived 2,000 years of history. Unsurprisingly, all 3 of these examples take us to Egypt, the place where the most ancient texts have survived. Just like today, people in the past had a lot of clutter. To clear up space, businessmen and government officials had to periodically dump thousands of files into trash heaps on the outskirts of town. Practically everywhere else in the world, these documents would just rot away or disintegrate, but buried under the dry sands of Egypt, some of these papers have endured to this day. To the average person, however, they hardly seem worth the effort of translating. As we saw with the certificates of pagan sacrifice, they often record the mundane lives of entirely mundane people. Records of taxes and loans, petitions to the government, inventories for storerooms and warehouses that are now themselves missing. Casual letters between men and women whose names now only exist on that page and nowhere else. It's the type of content you'd only read if you have trouble falling asleep. All of it written by the nameless army of average Joes, just clocking into a boring day at the office. An office that just so happened to be in ancient Egypt. These tens of thousands of documents seem of little value to anyone outside of historians and archaeologists, but a close inspection and a keen eye reveals that a handful of them might be far more valuable than they first appear. One such document has been given the name Leiden Papyrus Z, or SB 2014-606, currently held at the Rijksmuseum in the Netherlands. It originally came from a bundle of papyrus documents uncovered in the ancient Egyptian city of Elephantine, and is dated to about the time of the late Roman Empire, 425 to 450 AD. Scattered across several fragmentary pages is the copy of a letter addressed to the Roman Emperor, Theodosius II, and the start of the emperor's reply. By the way, recording both sides of an exchange, a copy of the letter received and the reply that's going to be sent, was the standard procedure in ancient times. In the copy of the received letter, written in Greek by a secretary, a Christian bishop beseeches Theodosius to order his army to protect church property from the attacks of desert nomads. A single, unintelligible line at the top of the following page is all of what remains of Emperor Theodosius' response. We don't know if he honored the bishop's request or not. That, and a few small words off to the side, written in a different hand from the scribes. Bene valere te copimos, a traditional Latin greeting translating to, "We desire that you be well." Now, there is no way to know for certain, but modern scholars have generally accepted that these words represent an autograph from the emperor himself in Constantinople, as a way to certify the letter and discourage forgeries. If true, this would give this tattered manuscript the unique distinction of containing the only surviving handwriting belonging to that of a Roman emperor, albeit a largely obscure one. So sadly, this means we can never make a museum containing the signatures of all the Roman emperors in the same way we can for all the US presidents. At the moment, that museum would have just a single display in it, Theodosius II's. Another example has been identified on a papyrus scroll discovered in the ancient city of Memphis. Named UPZ I-106, it dates to over 500 years before Theodosius' autographed letter, during the Ptolemaic period, when a Greek dynasty ruled Egypt as its last pharaohs. It is yet another boring administrative document, where a nameless scribe in what one French archaeologist described as beautiful handwriting has recorded again a letter of royal petition and the king's response. This time both sides of the correspondence are relatively intact. The petition comes from the chief of the Embalmers Guild, the guy that is responsible for turning people's bodies into mummies. Much like the Christian bishop we met centuries in the future, he complains of violence and begs for the king's protection against individuals unnamed, who have been personally assaulting and extorting him and his family. In his reply, the king, Ptolemy X Alexander I, the great-grandfather of the famous Cleopatra, tells the administrators in Memphis to let him have the resolution he seeks in every respect, giving his full support for the poor embalmer. Now what's interesting about the document is the fact that in the gap between the king's reply and the copy of the original letter, a hand different from the beautiful one of the scribe has somewhat sloppily scratched out Rarest, or the ancient Greek equivalent of farewell, in a thin, spider-like scribble. Researchers noticed that the long downward strokes of this word run over the line below it, meaning it could only have been written after the rest of the document. Like Theodosius II's greeting, it seems likely that this word was written by the king himself. After reviewing the letter, and giving his direct authorization that its orders be carried out. If true, this single word would be the oldest known autograph from a major historical figure, this time a powerful Hellenistic king, over 1,000 years older than those of El Cid or Charlemagne. But let's be honest, these two examples are somewhat underwhelming. Theodosius II and Ptolemy X Alexander I are not exactly household names today. They are D-listers as far as historical celebrities go. Although back in their day, they were among the most powerful men in the world, I highly doubt anyone watching this video has even heard of either of them until now. In a way, their autographs aren't much different from the countless signatures of average Joes that populate the overwhelming majority of our ancient documents. So, what if I told you that we may have the signature of someone in the ancient world that the average person today would almost certainly recognize? A clear A-list historical celebrity. A signature belonging to one of the most famous and well-known women in all of human history. This creased and wrinkled papyrus document from the ancient city of Abusir el-Malik has been given the label P25239. It has sometimes been reported that when it was first discovered in 1904, the document was wrapped around the body of a mummy. In truth, it's a bit more complicated. Sometime in the distant past, the text had been recycled as cartonnage, a mix of plaster and papyrus, a lot like modern paper mache. If you were ever curious, this was how ancient Egyptians created the masks and cases of mummies. In any case, like the other documents we have seen, at first glance, P25239 is not a particularly interesting find. The papyrus is a royal decree granting tax exemption status for a Roman man named Publius Canidos. Among other things, it says that he and his heirs will no longer need to pay taxes on annual shipments of wine and wheat. A pretty nice deal, if you ask me. After its initial discovery, the papyrus was filed away and stored in a German museum, still attached to its mummy casing, for almost 100 years, until in the year 2000 it was re-examined by several scholars. One of them was a Dutch papyrologist named Peter van Minnen. Minnen stitched it together and translated the document and found something pretty exciting. According to itself, it was received at its destination on the 26th day of the Egyptian month of Mekir, in the 19th year of the current ruler, or to us, February 23rd, 33 BC. This would mean that the date of the document's composition could only have been made during the reign of Cleopatra VII Philopator. Yes, the Cleopatra, the famed queen of Egypt, lover to both Julius Caesar and Mark Antony, mother of Little Caesar, alumni of Cologne High, and the monarch who unsuccessfully waged war against the Roman Republic in its final days. This revelation is only further confirmed by the subject of the tax exemption, Publius Canidos, a well-known Roman general and friend to Cleopatra's then-husband, Mark Antony. Also, side note, the hindsight of history tells us that Publius wouldn't have long to enjoy his new tax-exempt status because he would be killed in the Battle of Actium within the following 2 years. Womp womp. Still, none of these details make P25239 anything exceptional. We have dozens of surviving papyrus documents dating to the reign of Cleopatra. The only thing that makes this one special is the fact that at the very bottom of the page, someone has written a single word.
Unisthoi.
Or make it happen, make it so. Basically the Greek equivalent of do it. Like with the other suspected signatures, because the hand that wrote this word is different from the one that wrote out the rest of the document, this must be the signature of someone authorizing or certifying the decree be carried out. Whoever it was, their cursive handwriting was at least above average for the time, with a small, delicate, and fine hand, almost on the level of a professional scribe's. Much better than Hermias's and even better than Ptolemy X's. This hints that the signatory practiced their handwriting commonly, or at least commonly enough to sign documents well. Peter van Minnen has argued, and other scholars have agreed, that the only person who could have signed off on an order of this magnitude and directed towards someone so important was the Queen of Egypt herself, Cleopatra VII Philopator, and this would explain why the decree is a bit informal in its language, lacking the standard royal address. Even the good handwriting is in line with what we know about the famous queen. Roman historians record that Cleopatra was a scholar in her free time, well-read and sophisticated, so it would make sense for her handwriting to be above average, significantly better than her ancestors' chicken scratch. It seems likely that this document was a personal favor from the queen to one of her generals, and this one word at the bottom was made directly by her to ensure that that order was carried out. If true, it would mean that this unassuming papyrus document is the holy grail of historical autographs, an autograph so rare and special it almost defies monetary value. The odds of this random scrap of paper containing a single written word by someone so famous so long ago surviving to this day are almost astronomical. It just doesn't happen in archaeology. You don't get this close to these major players in history. To me, it makes Cleopatra feel more real, as if she could have scratched these letters out only a few minutes ago and I just missed her walking out of the room. However, unfortunately, like with the two other surviving ancient autographs we examined, it is impossible to fully confirm 100% that this word was really written by Cleopatra and not someone else. But all the evidence seems to point in that direction. The decree was made during her reign, under her orders, and someone of huge importance had to approve it. The scholarly consensus today has more or less agreed that a Cleopatra authorship is most likely. So here it is, in all likelihood, the rarest signature in history, Cleopatra VII's.
Unisthoi.
I got a chance to email the man that discovered the signature in the first place, Professor Peter van Minnen. I was curious to know if there were any more suspected famous ancient signatures besides the three we have discussed. He replied that sadly no additional ones have been found since the year 2000. These three are the only ones known to have survived. At least so far. I personally believe it is possible that scattered across the museums of the world, collecting dust, might be a couple more documents just like these, waiting for a fresh pair of eyes to spot and decode their secrets. The papyrus document seemingly containing Cleopatra's autograph was known since 1904, but it sat neglected for almost 100 years before scholars realized its true significance. So perhaps the next big discovery is just around the corner, waiting to be rediscovered. To finish off this exploration, I wanted to ask, what about celebrities that came from cultures that lacked writing entirely? We often forget that handwritten signatures are a relatively Western and European idea that didn't exist in many cultures around the world. What mark does one leave when they do not have letters or words to write them? Well, such a predicament occurred relatively commonly in the colonial era. Prior to the 16th century, the indigenous people of North America did not have a written language, but during European colonization of the continent, they were often forced to learn and use the concept of signatures, in some cases quite literally overnight. Inside countless Canadian and American government buildings, there are physical copies of old papers, signed as the lands were being colonized between the 1600s and 1800s. Many of them are legal and financial agreements with the native inhabitants of America. Lacking a written language themselves, the Native American leaders were almost always completely unfamiliar with the concept of handwritten signatures. So when dealing with the white man, they were forced to improvise. On these documents, much like those of medieval Europe or ancient Rome, a white scribe would write the name or nation of the native signatory, and the chief would doodle or sketch his own mark next to his name. These are almost always pictographic symbols that really stretch the definition of what counts as a signature. Racing across the bottom of these documents are hand-drawn turtles, stick figures, war clubs, birds, deer, wolves, faces, anything you can think of. The famous Mohawk leader King Hendrik apparently learned enough English letters to spell out his name, but still decided to combine these characters with a drawing, in this case a deer. In truth, these Native American signatures are almost a reinvention of the monograms used by medieval kings like Charlemagne. In many cases, the signatories could not have even understood the weight of such an action, not knowing that their marks would determine the future of their people for centuries to come. And funny enough, some of these documents and their doodle signatures are still valid in reference to this day. This treaty of 1677 between the English crown and the Indians of Virginia is still sometimes used, centuries later, and after the government that originally agreed to them was overthrown. Despite these people coming from far more recent periods of history than Cleopatra or even William Shakespeare, that doesn't make their signatures any less rare. Very likely, these are the only signatures they ever made over the course of their lives. There's one Native American signature in particular I'd like to highlight. On a sandstone wall overlooking Ash Creek, a few miles southeast of the Little Bighorn River in Montana, was a petroglyph consisting of a horse and a serpent. Native American petroglyphs like these are abundant in the West, but this one is significant because of who may have carved it. Local tradition, handed down from a Northern Cheyenne witness, claims that this drawing was created by the famous Lakota warrior, leader, and thunder dreamer, Tashonkawitko, or Crazy Horse. This was supposed to have been done a few days before the famous Battle of Little Bighorn, where the combined forces of Lakota, Northern Cheyenne, and Arapaho tribes defeated those of the US government, led by Lieutenant Colonel George Custer, a battle in which Crazy Horse played a decisive role. As far as we know, if true, this would be the only surviving drawing, and in a way, signature, from Crazy Horse, made within his relatively short life. Freely given, and unlike most Native American signatures, apparently not made under coercion of white settlers. Some have doubted its authenticity. Even modern Lakota historians have thought the story of its origin sounds a bit too good to be true. And as with Cleopatra's alleged signature, there is simply no way to verify or falsify this claim. But I do like the idea. Crazy Horse is one of the most famous Native Americans in history, but he is paradoxically an incredibly elusive figure, with not a single artistic depiction or photograph being taken while he was alive. Some have interpreted this petroglyph as Crazy Horse depicting himself and his struggle. He is the horse, and the snake behind him is his toka, his enemies, constantly pursuing him. The Lakota historian Joseph M. Marshall III's personal interpretation is that it is more of a statement than a signature. In his opinion, whoever this was, Crazy Horse or not, was saying, "This is where I am in my life. I was here." And in a way, that's what all signatures are at the end of the day. They are a way to record that we existed. We were alive, and we were ourselves, and no one else, even if it was just for a time. The Ash Creek petroglyph was destroyed in 1997. It is unclear if it was washed away by natural erosion or destroyed by vandals trying to remove the signature to resell it. I've heard reports of both. Whatever the truth is, it emphasizes the fragility of signatures and autographs. They are not only pieces of history, but very special pieces of history that, in my opinion, are able to make it feel far more intimate and alive than other artifacts. And though they typically don't survive long, when they do, they are able to connect us on such a personal level to these people that changed the world. And with that, thank you so much for watching. I'll see you next time.